All right, David Marchick is joining us here. He's the author of The Peaceful Transfer of Power, an oral history of Americans' presidential transitions. He's also the dean of the Kogod School of Business over at American University. David, Mike Leon, Nick Saveri, thank you so much for hopping on the podcast with us.
Thanks for having me.
David, you and I kind of were in each other's comments on LinkedIn the other day. Dr. Chavinsky, who's a mutual friend of ours, did a fantastic review of your book. And it's over my right shoulder here for the people watching us on YouTube, over Nick's shoulder as well. I want you to tell us a little bit about the book, but also I'm fascinated by Transition Labs and the work that you started to do with the Partnership for Public Service to really tell the story about the history of the peaceful transfer of power in this country. So tell us a little bit about all the work you've been doing in this space and what ultimately led to you writing this book.
Great. Thanks for having me again. So the Partnership for Public Service is a nonprofit, nonpartisan organization that's focused on making governments better, faster, more effective, and serving the American people better. And one of the theories of the Partnership for Public Service is that a effective government needs a good launch, and therefore a new president needs a good launch. So for 3 or 4 cycles, they have run projects to improve the process of presidential transitions, make them smoother, faster, better. And I was the director of the Center for Presidential Transition during the last cycle. So at the beginning of the project, which I started in October of 2019, someone said, "Hey, you should do a podcast on presidential transitions." And I said, "I'm not so sure. I'm not sure anybody would really listen. I'm not sure presidential transitions is going to be such a hot topic." Little did we know that it would be on the front page of every newspaper everywhere in the country. So we started the podcast and we decided to do a profile of every modern presidential transition since Jimmy Carter. And then looking back, we did profiles and deep dives on the worst transitions in history. So Buchanan to Lincoln and Hoover to Roosevelt. And the podcast took off. I mean, it was really incredible. It was, Politico said it was their favorite podcast of the cycle. And we had great guests. So we had pretty much every chief of staff from Reagan on, including James Baker III, who was Reagan's chief of staff and Secretary of State. We had Josh Bolten, John Podesta. We had historians like Ken Burns and Eric Rauchway, who's a historian and expert on Roosevelt. And it took off. And then because it took off and because the 2020 transition was so rocky, we decided to make a book out of it. And we took the transcripts of the podcast and then did an analysis of each of the transitions that we studied. And we wrote a book, and University of Virginia Press published it. Ken Burns did the preface and the foreword, and it's kind of taken off. So I'm very happy with the results and happy with the impact.
David, when we think about the history of presidential transitions, we think most notably of, from our first president, from George Washington, the advocate for a peaceful transfer, and that obviously set a precedent. When you've studied and through the conversations you've had, with these different transitions that we've seen historically, what do you find to be some of the most notable innovations? Like, what would be considered the most watershed moments in the evolution of that transition of power?
Well, a modern president faced gargantuan tasks when a candidate becomes president-elect and a president-elect becomes president. So the time between the election and the inauguration is typically around 75 to 77 days. In that short period of time, a president needs to name the cabinet, staff the entire White House, get ready to unveil a budget, a multi-trillion-dollar budget, run the government, which has 4 million employees. It's a gargantuan task. Just the personnel process alone is huge. So there are 4,000 political positions, 4,000, and 1,250 of them need to be confirmed by the United States Senate. It's almost impossible for a president to get those people in place. And so what modern transitions require is for candidates to start working very early, the spring of every election year, to get people starting to vet people for their potential appointments, to start planning the schedule, to start drafting executive orders, to start planning what they'll do if they are to win. So prior to About 20 years ago, candidates were criticized for being presumptuous for planning their transitions. So Bill Clinton famously didn't want to put a lot of time into transition planning because he didn't want to appear presumptuous. Now, the best practice is that everybody that runs for president needs to be presumptuous. They need to assume they're going to win, because if they wake up the day after the election and they won and they don't have plans, the whole country is going to be in bad shape.
David, I'm so glad that you said that, because it kind of feeds into a little bit of a follow-up here. There was a Mark Twain quote in your book about history not repeating itself, but it does rhyme. And right now, what we're seeing and what the news has covered around election denial and people that are not accepting, basic processes that are free and fair. And you guys get into that conversation with a few historians, like you mentioned, Ken Burns is featured in the book as well, about this conversation. But I want to get into a little bit of the kind of the foreshadowing and the transitions that happen, because this is not the most volatile period in our nation's history, funny enough. What do you make of some of the things that are happening right now in the political space, where people are not accepting normal processes that used to be mundane and under the radar, that nobody even checked for, and now we're having 24/7 news cycles of the confirmation, the December 14th process that comes into play with the electoral count? Like, normal things that used to fly under the radar are now no longer like that. They're being covered and given the attention. What do you make of all of this that's playing out now in the political space?
Well, let me quote someone who's smarter and more eminent than me, Ken Burns. So he came on the podcast twice. The first time he came on in the summer of 2020. And his message was, Dave, you're focused on the minutia. You're focused on personnel and the appointments and kind of the nuts and bolts. But let's step back and look at the history of the United States. We've had more than 230 years since George Washington handed the reins to John Adams, of one president handing off power to another. Presidents haven't wanted to leave, but they've left. And for 230 years, we've had this unbroken, peaceful transitions. And he used these words: no arms have been raised, no troops have been alerted, no shots fired, and no one's died. And so I had him on after January 6th, and I said, Ken, what about this statement? Because now we've had troops alerted, arms raised, shots fired, people died. And he said, this is unprecedented territory. I've chronicled the worst parts of American history: the Civil War, the violence in Vietnam, some of the civil rights problems, and the history of slavery in the United States. This is unprecedented. I think that we're taping this a week after the last election, where a lot of the election deniers lost, although some won. And I think the American people have spoken, which is we may not be unified, but we have to support the institutions of government, the foundations of democracy. And that's part of the essence of the book, which is to create some hope that we can get back to the nonpartisan, bipartisan focus on transitions, where the peaceful transfer of power from one president to another is peaceful, it's smooth, and even though one candidate lost, they respect the will of the American people.
David, when we think about an unpeaceful transition, like we just saw from the 2020 election, you just mentioned something important there about hope. Ideally, or at least from what you've learned in your various conversations, what are the safeguards that are currently in place, but then also should be in place to ensure that for all citizens, our perception of a smooth transition there, but also our willingness to believe in our system of democracy continues throughout either a perilous or an established transition of power?
So let's go back to the Kennedy-Nixon race of 1960. It was an incredibly close race. Kennedy essentially won by one vote per precinct across the United States. It was that close. And Nixon, seeing this result, many of his advisors encouraged him to fight the election, to deny the results, and to contest it. Now, Nixon was no paragon of virtue, as we know. But he basically said, I don't want to interfere with democracy. Kennedy won, and I don't want to imperil his start. And so he conceded to Kennedy in the middle of the night, even though it was an extremely close election, much closer than the Trump-Biden election. Congress in 1963 said that was actually a scary moment. We know that some of Nixon's advisors advised him to basically try to blow up the election and cast doubt on the integrity of our electoral process. And so Congress passed the Presidential Transition Act of 1963, which created norms and processes. That law has been amended multiple times over the last 50 years. And essentially, the law now requires the outgoing administration to cooperate with the incoming. So even under Trump's people did implement the law. They, under the radar, very carefully, did exactly what the law was required up until the election. And then when Trump focused on it, he kind of put the brakes on and threw everything up in the air. So fortunately, our institutions were bent, but they didn't break in the last election. Now, Congress, I think, can strengthen the laws. They can make it easier to start the formal transition process. You recall that the formal transition process was delayed about 30 days under the last election. They can empower career officials as opposed to political appointees with more authority. And they can start the transition process earlier. So those type of reforms, I think, would be beneficial for the country and would help avoid some of the problems we had in the 2020 election.
David, it's like you're feeding into these follow-ups, perfectly, because almost like you have access to our questions, because you mentioned a bunch of this stuff in the book, and I was talking about the process before. Somebody that's listening to this podcast, maybe they're going to a bookstore, they see your book. Tell us a little bit more in depth about why they should pick up this book, why this stuff is really important, because you've outlined a couple different moments, not only in talking with us right now, but that you outlined in the book. Everyone knows famously about Al Gore and George W. Bush and the holdup there and what that led to with respect to seats not being filled and an attack on this country, that was terrible. Tell us a little bit about what somebody seeing this book in the bookstore right now wants to read this and wants to learn more about why this process is so important and why what we've seen over the last 18 months is kind of an anomaly.
So it's literally a matter of life and death and our national security of our country. Let me just give you a couple examples. So again, a president has 77 days to get his or her people in place. And like you, with your with your podcast or with a big corporation, it relies on having people in place to do their jobs. This is one of the only spots in the world where when there's an election, literally the entire top layer of government clears out, the entire White House clears out. So when I worked for President Clinton, I entered the building on January 20th, 1993, and nobody was there. The desks were empty. The computers didn't work. It was just a building. So when Bush won, you recall that there was a dispute in Florida, 537 votes determined the outcome of one state, Florida, which determined who won 270 electoral votes. And the Supreme Court didn't rule until December 12th or December 13th, which means that Bush only had 36 or 37 days, which is about half the normal amount of time that a president has during the transition. Fast forward 8 months to when he took the oath of office. 2 planes hit the World Trade Center, a plane hit the Pentagon, and a plane crashed in Western Pennsylvania. So the worst terrorist attack in the United States since Pearl Harbor. Bush only had slightly more than half of his national security officials in place at the top level, half. And half of those had only been in office for 2 months. That meant that only 25% of the top officials had really been on the job for more than a few months. And the 9/11 Commission did an autopsy of what happened on 9/11, what worked, what didn't. And they found that this shortened transition imperiled President Bush's ability to get his national security team in place. And the fact that he didn't have his entire national security team in place imperiled the nation's national security readiness. So it's literally a matter of life and death. Now let's fast forward to 2020 during the last election. Biden faced the worst crises any president has faced since Roosevelt. We had 4 crises going on at the same time. We had a global pandemic, which peaked during the transition. 172,000 Americans died between Election Day and Inauguration Day. 172,000. We had a racial reckoning in the wake of George Floyd's murder, protests, tension, cities burning. We had an unemployment crisis with almost 20 million Americans out of work because of the pandemic. And then on top of that, we had a political crisis. So the most important policy issue when Joe Biden took office on January 20th was not some esoteric policy issue, not a tax issue, not a foreign policy issue. It was getting shots in arms. The vaccine was ready, but there was no distribution plan. And so it literally was a matter of life and death for President Biden, President-elect Biden, to be able to work with the Pentagon, to work with the Department of Health, to work with the Budget Office, to plan to get shots in arms, to get that distribution plan out the door so Americans could save their lives and get back to work. And that collaboration was delayed because of the lack of respect and the denial of the outcome of the election. So it's life and death. That's why this book matters.
David, something we often talk about with authors, especially those who've been in the history space, is the connection between your work to the American classroom. When we think about history instruction for high schoolers and even through middle school, and even when students go on to college, you just spoke about the importance of the transition from that standpoint, threats domestically and externally. But what would you say to the American history teacher in this country about the value of understanding and how to frame the importance of transitions? Because we think often in history curriculum from the standpoint of specific dates, right? Like 1865, 1861, 1776. We think of these very specific moments, but you're speaking to process. What's the value of understanding process in the American history classroom?
So the process is essential for an effective government to serve the American people. Process is critical to uphold the foundations of our democracy. And process is not sexy, but it's what gets the job done. And so here the book highlights the good, the bad, the ugly of various processes that candidates and president-elects have used to get ready to be president on January 20th, to hit the ground running. What's worked, what hasn't worked. And this, I've received emails and calls from business schools, from political science departments, from high school teachers all across the country saying, this is really important. Every other aspect of the presidency has been dissected numerous times. There are 15,000 books on Lincoln alone, but there are very few books that have focused on presidential transition. I think there are 4 or 5 that have been written in history. I read all of them. And so the goal of this book was to contribute to the literature, to contribute to understanding, and ultimately to help future officials who are part of transition plannings to do their job better, faster, more efficiently, to serve the American people and help their president-elect hit the ground running. That's why it's important.
David Marchick is the Dean of the Kogod School of Business over at American University. But more importantly, he's the author of a really good book, The Peaceful Transfer of Power, an oral history of Americans' presidential transitions. The book is over both of our shoulders. David, you don't have the book over your shoulder. We're promoting the book more than you over here. I know. Thank you so much for hopping on the podcast. Continued success to you. Go get David's book now, available wherever books are sold. Thank you again for hopping on the podcast. Stay safe and continued success to you, sir.
Thank you very much. Thanks for having me.
Hey, thanks for watching the Can We Please Talk podcast. Whatever clip you just watched, we hope you enjoyed it, and we hope you stick around for some more. Subscribe to the channel. My partner's over here smashing the button. Come on, do him a favor. So hit subscribe.